Hi folks, thanks for tuning in. I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study of some time I spent with OVO, looking at how we could scale agile working without having a massive agile function. It's something I'm really passionate about because I really believe that us folks in the agile world should be working to make ourselves redundant, and this was a really great opportunity to try and put that into practice. Before we dive into the detail, just a quick introduction to myself. So my name's Amanda. I'm a business agility coach and consultant, and I use lean, agile and growth marketing techniques and practices to help businesses grow, innovate and deliver value quickly at scale. Some of the organizations I've worked with are hopefully familiar to you: Moonpig, Gusto, Flagstone, which is a fintech startup, and of course OVO, who I'm going to talk about today. So let me tell you a little bit about OVO. So you might sort of have the perception that, oh, OVO is one of those big energy companies, big sort of, legacy, monolithic behemoth. In fact, it's not. It's a very modern organization, also much younger than people might think. So it was founded in 2009, originally started as OVO Energy, but OVO is actually now a group of brands. So as well as OVO Energy, they've also acquired Spark, Boost and Corgi and SSE. So that makes them the third largest energy company in the UK now. Another brand that they have internally is Kaluza, and Kaluza is an ecosystem of technical platforms, and this is really a big part of helping OVO realize its mission, which is all about clean and affordable energy for everybody, how we can have a greener, cleaner future. OVO also have an international presence, so they're active in France, Spain and Australia. In terms of the size of the organisation, as you might guess, being the third largest energy company in the UK, it's pretty big. In terms of product and engineering, over 50 engineering teams, so quite a sizable scale. In terms of the culture, as I mentioned, they're not one of these big legacy energy organisations. I sort of think of OVO as having been born agile, really. They were born in the agile era and very much founded on agile values. So they've always been a very outcome-focused organisation. They obviously have this very clear mission. And in terms of their day-to-day working, very product-led, very outcome-centric from that point of view. Heavily invested in technology. They've always seen technology as being something really powerful that can help them achieve this greener, cleaner future. Very people-centric organisation. They really value talent, engagement, something that they work hard at, and empathy is a very important quality that they look for in their leaders. I would also describe their leadership as being very agile. They look to lead with context rather than control. And very much in line with that, they have a very strong culture of autonomy and ownership. So they really believe in trying to give their teams and individuals as much freedom as possible to make the right decisions. However, for all of these great things, like all organizations, they have their challenges. And the challenge that I was involved with was helping them with their agile delivery. And essentially the problem statement that they gave me initially was that agile delivery just wasn't quite where they wanted it to be. They said, we've heavily invested in talent, we've got some really great people, but we just don't see the delivery as being where we thought it would be. I've already mentioned that they're a very outcome-focused organization. So that's a really important part of how they work. They're not output-centric. However, if you're interested in achieving outcomes, you want to be able to fail fast, and you can't fail fast until you can deliver fast. So this was still a problem that they were very keen to solve. So the overall objective really was to try and improve the ways of working. And the kind of outcomes we were looking at were, how can we increase speed and predictability? But the bit that for me was interesting was, how can we do this without scaling up the agile function? So as I mentioned, OVO's got over 50 engineering teams, and at the time I started working with them, they had 2 agile coaches. So one obvious solution might be, well, we just need loads and loads more agile coaches in order to solve this problem. But I wanted to see if there was a way that we could do it without having this massive agile function, without creating this big dependency and this need as they carried on growing to have to keep scaling up the function. So I wanted to impose this constraint. Let's try and improve it without massively growing the Agile function. And really what I was interested in is how can we embed the Agile skills, the knowledge and the behaviors within the culture so we can create something self-sustaining, something that is Agile without having a dependency on lots of Agile people. So this was a sort of challenge that we set ourselves. And we decided as an initial proof of concept, we'd look at the Kaluza brand. So with 30+ engineering teams within the Kaluza brand, it's very much the sort of technical future, I guess, of OVO. And there's also a lot of attention and pressure around it at the moment. So it seemed like a good place to start. So we thought, let's have a look at Kaluza. Let's see what we can do there. If we can prove the concept, then we know this is something that we can take across the rest of the organization. And we really wanted to try and achieve this by looking more holistically and going, okay, we can see that Agile delivery is not working, but why is that? And what do we need to change? So really trying to be problem focused, think of the problems first, and then start figuring out the solutions. So we started off with some initial discovery, and off the back of this, we came up with 4 key focus areas. So the first one was providing some clarity. So Agile is practiced 100 different ways in 100 different organizations, and it wasn't really clear when we talk about Agile working at OVO, what is it that we mean? What do we expect? Lots of organizations like to sort of define their Agile working by having, specific methodologies. We definitely didn't want to go down that route, but we did need some kind of definition and some kind of guidance. So that was the first area to focus on. Second area was some basic upskilling around competence. It was obvious that, competence fluctuated a lot between teams and individuals. So there were definitely areas where we needed to help people increase their Agile skills and thinking. The third area was around measuring process health. So over a very data-driven organization. So in terms of looking at customer outcomes, engagement, platform health, lots of different things they measure, nothing around process health though. So this meant that it was very subjective, very opinion driven, and it meant we couldn't really see where are we now, where are the opportunities to improve, and how do we know if we're actually getting any better. And then the fourth area was around increasing accountability. So I mentioned that OVO have this culture of very high autonomy. If you want high autonomy to succeed, you also need high accountability. If you're giving people freedom, you need to make sure that they're taking on the responsibility. And we could see that where we sometimes had accountability issues is because we didn't have clear expectations. And if you haven't set clear expectations, very hard to hold people accountable to them. So I'm going to talk through each one of these in a little bit more detail. So first of all, providing clarity. So the first thing we wanted to do was to come up with a really simple definition of what do we mean by Agile working. When we talk about Agile, people define it 100 different ways. What does it mean for OVO? So what we came up with is that agility is about working in short feedback loops. When we talk about working in an Agile way, that's what we're trying to achieve. And the reason why we want to do this is firstly because it increases value. So we want to reduce wasted investment in products and services that our customers aren't going to want. And secondly, because we want to improve quality. We want to make sure that we're building scalable, maintainable, resilient platforms. And actually this language around short feedback loops, we evolved over the course of the year, because what we started to recognize was that people grasped the concept of a short customer feedback loop. But when it came to improving quality, people didn't really see the value of working in small batches and breaking things down. So we started to talk about the short development feedback loop, and that being the bit that improves quality, this idea of constantly optimizing for working software, sort of driving what I think of as that continuous integration mindset. So that was the first thing, simple definition of Agile. Secondly, we wanted to provide some kind of guidance in terms of, well, how do we actually practice Agile? I think one of the challenges with Agile is because it's a set of principles, principles are a bit like ingredients. Here are some top quality ingredients. You can make a fantastic cake with these. Problem is, you've got to figure out the recipe on your own. And I think this is why different methodologies and frameworks become so dominant, is because they provide this recipe. And we definitely didn't want to go down the route of prescribing specific methodologies. We wanted to preserve that freedom and autonomy for teams, but we did need to give them something. So what we came up with was a set of guardrails, which we referred to as minimum viable agility. And this was essentially a short set of practices. So we were trying to translate principles into, okay, what does that look like on the ground? What does that mean in terms of how I work day to day? And what this would give us is making sure that we were working in an agile way, but still giving teams huge scope to tailor, optimize bespoke processes that suited the work they were doing, their size, their context. And the other thing this would do is provide some clear expectations. So when we're saying we want to work in an agile way, these are the kind of things that we're looking for. And in terms of what was actually on that list, that minimum viable agility. So firstly, defining outcomes and measures of success. So this is really about value. Let's make sure we're building the right thing. In the case of OVO, they use the OKR framework, objectives and key results. Measuring platform health. So yes, we want to achieve good outcomes and we want to work quickly, but we care about the quality of our platform. So this was all about quality. In the case of OVO, they looked at things like service level objectives. We also, over the course of the year, started to introduce some of the DORA metrics. So looking at things like deployment frequency, change failure rate, mean time to mitigate, that kind of thing. Working in small batches, limiting work in progress and measuring cycle time and throughput. So this was really about the speed piece, the optimizing for the short feedback loop, the sort of core of agility, I guess. Visualizing work and holding daily stand-ups. So I guess these were the only sort of specific processy type things that we were really clear on. And the idea of this was to really help teams to focus on finishing, making sure we're actually focused and getting things over the line. And finally, holding regular retrospectives. So obviously making sure that we are ring fencing time to think about how we're working and to ask ourselves, are we getting better? So this was our set of guardrails. And the idea was that these things were non-negotiable. We expect teams to be doing all of these things, but the context in which you do them is entirely up to you as a team. So lots of flexibility there, but enough guidance and enough clarity to make sure that we are going to be working in an agile way. So the second thing we looked at was upskilling. So increasing the level of agile competence, skills and behaviours. So unsurprisingly, first element of that was just getting some training in place. And we focused on engineering managers and product managers. Engineering managers were already accountable for delivery. So this was one of the opportunities to sort of scale the agile thinking and working without scaling the agile function, was actually if we focus on the engineering managers and we give them the tools, the techniques and the practices, they already know their teams, they already know their strengths and weaknesses, they know the context, they have the relationships, they have the influence. They're actually much better placed to influence their team. So if we can give them the skills and the techniques and the practices, we can actually scale the uptake of this way of working without needing necessarily hundreds of scrum masters to help us out. The training itself very much focused on that minimum viable agility. So looking at the purpose, but also the value of the guardrail. So if we're going to say, we expect you to be doing something, let's sell it. Why is it valuable? And really try and engage people with the value of that. In terms of the format, we opted for a sort of bite-sized learning approach. So 7 hours over 7 days actually worked really well, got really good feedback about that, gave people time to absorb and reflect and avoided information overload. That was the initial set of training. The other thing that we did was introduce agile onboarding workshops. So for all new joiners, within their first 4 weeks, they would do an afternoon's workshop. And the idea of this was to help them understand this whole concept of minimum viable agility, how we wanted to work and why we wanted to work that way. And this was part of creating that self-sustaining agility, making sure that everybody knew. So you get everyone within the company to a certain point, but then you want to make sure that all the new people that you bring in are quickly brought up to that same point. You get everybody on the same page. The second element following the training was really about follow-up and support. So, training is great, but unfortunately, it's always very different when you start putting things into practice. Training tends to look at theory and it all makes perfect sense. And then you get into the real world and it's a little bit more complicated than you thought it was going to be. And the way we positioned this was that engineering managers would be responsible for leading improvement. So they were accountable for the health of their teams. They would lead the changes. So they had the ownership for it. They would decide what was going to change and how they were going to go about that. But the Agile coaches would provide troubleshooting, guidance and support for them. So immediately after the training with each engineering manager, we had conversations around, okay, you know your team, and we've done the training. Where do you see the opportunities to improve? What are the things that you're planning to do? How can we help? And that follow-up and support went on long term. So we were constantly there as a resource to tap into, to provide that guidance, to provide that troubleshooting, and gradually allow those people more and more independent and confident. So the third element was around measuring process health. So we wanted some way to see, well, where are we now? Where are the opportunities to improve? And how do we know if we're actually getting better? In terms of what we measured, it very much focused around those sort of core elements of creating short feedback loops. So small batches, limiting work in progress. If you do those things, you get speed, you get volume, and you get predictability. So the measures we put in place very much aligned around these things. So speed, volume, and predictability. So this dictated our key metrics. So speed, we were looking at cycle time. Volume, we were looking at throughput, and then, of course, predictability. So we thought of these as our North Star health metrics. These are the things that ultimately we're optimizing for. And when we were talking to engineers about this as a way of sort of engaging them in the value of measuring things, we describe these as being a little bit like an alerting system. If you've got a really high cycle time, that's a bit like an alert. It's telling you that there's a problem with your system of work. Your process isn't as healthy as it could be. That's an indicator that you might want to go and investigate. However, when it comes to things like cycle time, throughput, or predictability, lots of different things can be influencing it. So how do we figure out what's actually driving that high cycle time or that low throughput? And that's where our next set of data comes in. So these were really about insights that could help debug those areas. So when it came to small batches, we had some batch size metrics. So we looked at things like average issue size, average time in progress. Obviously, bigger issues, going to take longer, going to drive up your cycle time. Likewise, if you consistently see things spending lots of time in progress, probably an indicator that it's too big, you might want to look at breaking it down a bit. The other thing we looked at was what I called focus metrics, which was all around how well we were limiting work in progress. So we looked at things like at the end of a sprint or an end of a Kanban cycle, how many items do we typically have in progress? And if that number is consistently high, it's maybe an indicator that the team are better at starting things rather than finishing things. We also looked at workflow bottlenecks, similar kind of concept. Where does work build up and get stuck? So these are essentially leading indicators. So we knew that if we could improve these things, then these key metrics were going to improve. And the way we described these when we were talking to engineers, these are a little bit like logging. So you sort of get an alert that your cycle time is too high. And when you start to debug that, these are some of the things that can help you figure out what's influencing that cycle time. And once you've been able to identify what's influencing the cycle time, then you can have a conversation about why is that happening? What do we need to do differently? What can we experiment with in future to try and change that? And then, of course, you can use these metrics to then go, well, we changed something. Did that have an impact? Has it solved the problem? Has it made things better or worse? So these were the actual metrics that we put in place. How did we use them? So the first area was we introduced this concept of what we call data-driven retros, which was essentially, let's use this process health data as an input into our retrospective discussions, something that that we can look at, that we can review, that we can use to identify opportunities, identify problems, and we can have those retro discussions around how we make improvements. So the metrics were really there as a tool for people to identify problems, opportunities, and measure improvements. Like all data, it's really there as a good learning and improvement tool. The other thing that it was helpful for was to help teams demonstrate the impact of problems beyond the team's control. So, for example, a team might have lots of dependencies that end up slowing them down. That's not something the team themselves can solve, but if they can use data to demonstrate the impact that that's having on them, they can then escalate that and get support to change it. Which brings us to the second area where we use the data, which was in what OVO called operational reviews. So they'd started to introduce regular reviews with tech leadership and teams that were focused mainly on platform health. So they were looking at things like service level objectives and breaches to those, incidents, security vulnerabilities, etc. So we decided to introduce the process health metrics into those sessions as well, so we could also look at that data. And what that did was, first, it gave leadership sort of visibility of that process health and improvement. It meant they could offer guidance, they could give support. It was another coaching opportunity, if you like. It also meant they could challenge the teams as well. So if they could see things were consistently going wrong and there didn't appear to be any learning and improvement off the back of that, they could start to challenge the teams a little bit. It didn't really matter what the data was saying. The numbers themselves didn't matter. It was more about what direction are we trending in? Are we learning from mistakes and making changes and getting better? Or are we just making the same mistakes over again? So the accountability piece was really about continuous improvement rather than being held to a specific number. And of course, the other opportunity was to surface those systemic problems. So when teams identified those systemic problems and the impact of them, these operational reviews acted as a feedback loop. So they could surface those things, they could bring them to the attention of leadership and ask for support to resolve them. So process health, that was the third thing. Fourth and final thing was around increasing accountability. So I've also already talked about some of the other measures which influenced accountability. So things like having that clear definition of Agile and having those guardrails. That was one way of setting expectations and having something to hold people accountable to. Being able to surface that process health data, again, that was something that could be used to help improve accountability. But we did recognize that to really embed it within the culture and to make agility intrinsic, we needed to go a step further. So really, we wanted to make sure that the expectations were really clear. There was, within the leadership team, very clear idea of what they expected people to be doing, but it was very much an implicit expectation. It wasn't necessarily recognized within teams. And of course, if you don't make your expectations clear, you can't be surprised when your expectations aren't met. So in terms of really defining those expectations, we looked at the engineering competency matrix and the career framework. And what we were looking to do was to clearly link agile skills and behaviors to reward and recognition. So to really set out what it was we expected, make it clear to people, and to make it clear that if you wanted to progress within the organization, this was something that we expected. It's no good just being really great technically and developing your technical mastery. There are other things that we're expecting as well that we're going to take into account. And that was really important in terms of embedding it within the overall culture. I'll go through the evolved competency matrix in a second and let you know what that looked like. The other thing we did in this space was defining roles and responsibilities, particularly for those more senior team members. So we had engineering managers who had a clear accountability for delivery. But what we were finding was, because the engineering managers were hands-off, they weren't actually actively involved in delivery themselves on a day-to-day basis, that they'd sort of ended up pulling accountability out of the teams, and we needed more accountability within the teams. And again, there was definitely an expectation from leadership that there would be certain responsibilities and activities that those senior team members would be taking responsibility for. And again, we weren't seeing it because that expectation wasn't clear. So we just actually came up with some role descriptions for those senior engineers to actually define those expectations and push some of that accountability within the teams, create a bit more self-organization, if you like. In terms of the competency matrix, this is what we landed on. So we had these 4 pillars of value, mastery, ways of working, and behaviors. And then within each of those, we had a couple of subcategories. So when it came to value, we were looking at things like product mindset. So this is very much about, let's define the problem before we start defining a solution. Commercial mindset, so actually thinking about the impact of the things you're building, and also thinking about, well, how are we building it? Are we thinking about the cost of the system we're building and long term what the impact of that is? And then the other element was this data-driven approach, and whether that's about driving customer outcomes, platform health, process health, making data-informed decisions, and using data as a way to see if you're creating the desired impact or not. Obviously, mastery was a part of it. So this was very much around that technical competency. So looking at things like code and design, operations and security. The third element was around ways of working. So this was very much that piece around the sort of short feedback loop and some of those agile skills. So looking at agility and delivery, of course, continuous improvement, communication, collaboration, again, all really important parts of good agile working. And finally, behaviors. So really putting some emphasis on things like growth mindset. So this idea of constantly learning and improving yourself, and then also ownership and accountability. So again, when you've got these high levels of autonomy and you want this really autonomous culture, really important to have that ownership and accountability there, people taking responsibility, making things happening, making responsible decisions. Also worth saying that for all of these things, we had very detailed examples of what this looked like. So OVO didn't have job titles, they had different levels. So we made sure for each of these things, we were very clear through examples around what would we expect for, level 1, which might be sort of graduate or intern level, versus, a senior engineer or a principal engineer at level 4 or 5. So it was really clear to people what we were looking for. And that was the important thing, was to provide that clarity, make it much easier for people to self-assess, identify their development areas, and also for engineering managers to be able to support people in terms of identifying their strengths and weaknesses, helping them develop really good personal development plans and objectives. So those are all the things that we did. Did it work? I'll do a quick recap on the focus areas. So we looked at providing clarity, so that definition of agile and those guardrails. Upskilling, so training, follow-up and support. Measuring process health, so putting those process health metrics in place and then starting to use them in retrospectives and operational reviews. And then finally, increasing accountability, so looking at roles and responsibilities, but also embedding these agile skills and behaviors within the competency matrix and career framework to make it clear that, these things are non-negotiable. We want to work in an agile way. It's an important part of our culture. So we're going to set that out as a clear expectation. And in terms of the impact, what you can see here is graphs from the various teams that we had. So each coloured line on a graph represents a team. And this was looking at cycle time from February last year through to December. So that sort of 10, 11 month period. And what you can see is that for the most part, we saw pretty good improvements, and in some cases, some really dramatic improvements. We were looking for, just to explain what these black lines mean, we were ideally looking to get all teams consistently below 3 days. So for a sort of sprint level, Kanban level story or task, we were trying to encourage teams to get those done within 3 days to get that really short feedback loop in place. 5 days was a sort of upper benchmark, if you like. So if you're under 5, you're in a good place, but really we were optimizing for 3. And as you can see, pretty decent improvements for the most part. Not everywhere though. We had some areas where we basically didn't see the improvements that we wanted to. And I think this is why things like that competency matrix are so important, because generally speaking, if teams are trying to get better, they do, because they're recognizing there are improvements to be made, they're making changes to how they work, and eventually they will start to see the benefits. Whereas if you're not changing anything, you're not going to get better. And I think that's where making it clear that this, continuous improvement was not optional, not something you opted into, was really important. And that's why I think to deal with some of the areas where we didn't see improvements, we needed that. But for the most part, we were pretty happy with what we saw. So the conclusion was that, yes, we felt the proof of concept had been successful. We'd seen improvements for the most part across 35 teams with very minimal support from coaches. If you think there was 3 coaches and 35 teams, we were able to create a very big impact with very few of us, because the ownership for improvements very much lived within the teams. We felt like we were starting to create that self-sustaining agile culture because we'd set these clear expectations and accountabilities. And obviously those were only just starting to be introduced. In fact, we didn't start to introduce them until after December 2020, after those graphs. So it's too soon to see the impact of those. This also enabled us to redefine the purpose of the Agile function. So to make it really clear, these are not project managers that we want teams to be dependent on. The Agile function is very much going to be an enabling team. It's there for guidance and support. It's not there for execution. So it's almost sort of allowed the Agile function to behave a little bit like an internal consultancy. There was expertise there when you needed it, but it was there to provide the expertise and the guidance, not to actually do things for the teams. Teams retain that ownership, which again, in line with that culture of autonomy, was really important for OVO. And what this means for OVO is that they can, they're like many organizations, they're growing fast. This means they can continue to scale their engineering and still maintain this very small Agile function. And it also gives them the option in the future to have no Agile function at all if they want to. Obviously, in the short term, there's still upskilling to be done, there's still improvements to be made, but as that self-sustaining Agile culture starts to take hold, that dependency should get less. So in the future, that might be an option for them as well. So yeah, that's how we managed to do Agile without the Agile coaches, reduce that dependency, provide the guidance and support, but really push the ways of working and the ownership into the teams, and essentially work to make ourselves redundant. Thank you very much.